Builds in Ghostlore all start with your class, and the most beginner-friendly class is the Feral. First off, one of the Feral's best abilities, focus on your basic attack, and your basic attack never gets disabled, which means even when your skills are down, you always have access to a reliable source of damage. Furthermore, Feral has one of the best defensive skills in the game, a Warcry style move that increases your absorb, the game's equivalent of armor or another form of damage reduction. Plus, the Feral has damage mitigation, preventing one-shots, and of course, healing. In other words, it's the entire package. So naturally, when I was looking around and thinking, what build in Ghostlore is most appropriate for beginners, it was a Feral build that I decided on. More accurately, Feral, Exorcist, Hasashin, although Hasashin won't really come in until you reach the endgame. The build focuses on two buff skills, White Tiger and Battle Roar. White Tiger transforms you into a tiger. You unleash your inner fury and, fury, and tear your foes apart. Battle Roar is a buff that increases your health, healing, and damage absorption. The reason we pick up Exorcist early is to get access to Mandala, another powerful damage buff, and Exorcise and Infliction, which curses your enemies, reducing their effectiveness in combat. All in all, this combines into a build that feels extremely fast, especially if you're using Kukri. You're able to dash between packs without an issue, and later on you'll have access to Shroud of Darkness to reduce enemy detection and kind of slip unnoticed in between foes. Furthermore, you have more than enough damage to deal with bosses. For example, the boss that I fought in the beginning was Hellgate Island level 5, where monsters are well over level 200 and pose a significant challenge. And finally, like I mentioned near the start, this is a basic attack focused build, which means your damage never truly turns off. A lot of other builds require you to manage mana, this build doesn't need that. A lot of other builds require you to hit your skills, this build automates them. Sure, if you want something a little more interactive, you can set certain skills to manual use, and use them at your own discretion, but overall, the automated version works just fine and has plenty of damage for a lot of the game's content. Because you're a base Feral, you won't have to worry about early deaths from bosses. In fact, you'll be tanky enough to face tank most of their abilities, and you get even stronger when reaching low life. Plus, the build isn't too gear or glyph reliant. So, whether you're picking the game up for the first time, returning after early access, or just looking to play something new, I'd say the Weretiger Feral build is a great place to start. And let's get into a few more details, particularly about the skills, glyphs, and gearing to look out for. So first up, in Feral, your main skills are Battle Roar and Weretiger. As you can see from Weretiger, it gives you move speed, making you faster, Flat Absorb, which is extremely powerful, Poise, preventing enemies from interrupting you, Basic Attack Speed, so your attacks will feel super responsive, and Basic Attack Damage. Also, the skill itself replaces your basic attack. Now, it is a temporary buff, lasting around 6 seconds, with a fairly long cooldown. This is why you want to use the buff strength and buff duration nodes available in both Feral and Exorcist. You also want Fury on hit, plus a little lifesteal, and try to make all of your skills cost health instead of mana. As you level up and gain access to Summon Guardian Spirit from the Exorcist tree, you'll be able to transform your tiger into a White Tiger. This gives two main advantages. The first of which is, you can now apply 2 times as many effects to your skill. So more buff strength, more skill multiplier, which does multiply the damage, and more crit scaling from Hasashin. The other advantage is, it transforms the basic attack steroid into ice damage, meaning you could often freeze enemies, prevent them from moving or acting, and overall give yourself a much safer time. Next up, Battle Roar. This increases your absorb, health, and healing per second. It lasts fairly long and has a fairly short cooldown, meaning it should have almost permanent uptime even without much buff duration multiplier, though you want buff strength multiplier anyway, so you might as well add at least a few of those, especially on the overlap with White Tiger. Next, I added Trigger when transformed, because lowering the skill damage multiplier doesn't seem to negatively affect the buff, and it's a great way to have permanent uptime on Battle Roar. This increases your absorb so much that most enemies early on in the game simply can't damage you. Then, as you approach the late game, I suggest taking Blood Magic and transforming it into Blood Reeve. This is a skill, meaning it's not scaled that well by the rest of your damage. However, it has a massive 30% HP steal, and a pretty high skill-based damage. In other words, it's a pretty good thing to throw into your build, especially if you're triggering it on kill or triggering it on crit like I am. Then in terms of key feral skills, Adrenaline Rush is a great early option. It gives you attack speed and absorption. This scales depending on the number of enemies nearby, so get in the face of your foes. I promise it'll go well. Next, I like to take Metabolism. This is one-shot protection, converting 60% of damage taken into dot, which you then negate with your lifesteal. And finally, Viral is 30% increased health, which is great as you get later and later into the endgame, facing more challenging foes. Next up, from Exorcist, like I mentioned, you take Summon Guardian Spirit for Weretiger, and then you also take Mandala. Place a magical symbol on the ground that increases damage. You're limited to 1, and it does scale off of buff modifiers. So try to overlap it in some way with your Battle Roar for maximum effect. Right now, I have mine down here to overlap with Shroud of Darkness, though I've also experimented with swapping that around and putting it up here, which kind of puts it in line with more of a Battle Roar buffs. I honestly haven't quite decided which feels better, and I suggest playing around with a skill grid for yourself until you find something that works perfectly for you. The problem with this placement up here is it doesn't overlap with all the other triggers, but it does gain a little bit more buff effect. Then, finally, I'm also using Exercise, which greatly lowers enemy resistances, thus making your elemental damage far more effective. It also lowers Absorb, so physical damage is totally fine as well. I'm auto-casting these via, well, trigger on kill, trigger on crit, and trigger when transformed. All the triggers, since again, I just want them up as much as possible. In terms of other skills allocated, I went for skill charge buff strength, some skill multiplier to increase the effect of Weretiger, and then I invested heavily into the special skills. Hex for infliction strength multiplier to scale Exercise, feedback loop for MP skill and chance for triggered skills to not use a charge. This is mostly for the chance to not use a charge. The MP skill doesn't matter because I don't spend mana. And near death experience, if I ever mess up, I will get a shield and overall hopefully be fine. Finally, Hasashin is a damage utility tree that scales extremely well the more your character is built out. This is because you need a high crit rate to take advantage of the critical multiplier here, and that's done via glyphs, which I'll cover in just a little bit. You also get accuracy, which is really good on high Hellgate levels, and the very nice trigger on crit that has no damage penalty. And since you crit a lot, this is up, well, fairly frequently. The only Hasashin skills that I'm using, Dashing Strike to make Blood Reave, and of course, Shroud of Darkness for Zoom movement plus forcing enemies to ignore me. Next up, we have the gear and glyphs. On your weapon, personally, I like the Kukris, although a parang with a very high damage rating, or even a quiver, can also work, kind of just up to you what weapon you prefer. That said, try to go for the following stats on your weapon. Sockets to add flat elemental damage, basic attack damage, additional elemental damage, crit chance, and attack speed. I have almost everything I want here, I'm just missing the attack speed. And then I have a couple other weapons which aren't quite as good. This one has great attack speed but is missing all the flat damage, though it does have nice sockets and it would probably be okay to use. For the rest of my gear, I'm looking for things like skill cooldown rate, buff strength multiplier, increased basic attack damage, or again, flat elemental damage. Defensive stats like block chance are also incredibly nice, that's why I'm still using the shield despite getting it quite a few levels ago. Absorb is nice defensively. Resistances are not as important since your Tiger form gives you a massive amount of elemental resistance, which in most cases will cap you. Then for the other pieces of gear, it's pretty much everything that I mentioned before, though you'll get a little bit more damage on things like your scarf and your amulet, and a little more defense on things like your hat and your shield. For glyphs, there's a couple that are really important. The first of which is Nasin. This gives attack speed, and attack speed is one of the best ways to scale your damage, since it affects your basic attacks. Now, if you're short on crit rate, stack Iloglyphs. Really, if you're below 100% crit chance, Iloglyphs with Utala are probably your best choice, and if you're close to 100% crit chance, Iloglyphs with Sona are still pretty darn good, since they also give more additional ice damage, which scales all of your basic attack, like I mentioned at the start. Now, on the other hand, if base damage is what you're missing, go for Alasa glyphs. I found that personally in my current setup, Alasa isn't that useful, which is why I don't have too many of them. But this one happens to be quite nice because it has additional poison damage and crit strike chance. Last but not least, personally, I like to have a Suli glyph. This is mostly just for the coins found in EXP multiplier. It's something I like to throw in my builds, but absolutely don't feel like it's necessary. Then for stats, go for basic attack damage, increased basic attack damage, attack speed, and flat elemental damage. As many rolls as possible, the highest rarity possible, and just go with what you end up finding. Don't worry too much about, oh, I need exactly the same number of ILO as in the video. Last but not least, we have food bonuses. In my opinion, one of your best options is Durian Puffs, because this gives basic attack damage. Remember, Weretiger scales off of your basic attack damage, so this is a very significant multiplier. I also like fish head curry for the increased attack speed, or fried carrot cake if I need some additional accuracy. Shaved ice will give you ice damage, that's also another good option. And then Papaya is also good if you want increased buff strength. That will scale the bonuses you get from both Weretiger and Battle Roar. So if I decided that this fish head curry, it's not quite good enough, 10.5% increased attack speed, I've already got a lot from other sources, I can just drop a food buff, try this, buff strength multiplier, and hey, now my buffs are just a little bit stronger, both in terms of increasing the positive effects on me, and also increasing the damage that I do. So hopefully that's everything you need to know about how to play this build in Ghostlore. Like I mentioned, I picked this one in particular because it's the most beginner-friendly thing I could think of. Whenever you're in combat, all you really have to do is worry about basic attacking. When Tiger forms up, you'll have massive amounts of damage reduction, and also massive amounts of cleave. Because your buff skills are automated, you don't have to worry about hitting them by accident or forgetting to use them at all. Plus, because Battle Roar has almost permanent uptime, even if you forget to go into Tiger form and you're a little bit slow, you'll have plenty of defenses and it should be fine to drop to half health, clear all those negative statuses on you, pop into Tiger form, and start mauling face. Now, there is one other stat that I have in a few places which I wanted to mention. That is cooldown recovery speed on hit. What this does is, as you hit enemies with your basic attack, it lowers the cooldown of things like your Tiger form. With just a little bit of this, you effectively have 100% uptime, and all you have to do is find the nearest pack of enemies, smack them once or twice, and it will be back if the buffs have fallen off. This ends up making the build feel much more fluid. Though just because you can maintain permanent uptime doesn't mean you absolutely have to. It's totally fine to kind of skip enemies by running through them with Shroud of Darkness, and popping into Tiger form only when you're getting to a juicy pack or a boss that you need to kill. In fact, focusing on running through packs and boss rushing is one of the best ways if you're trying to progress Hellgate Island. Early on, especially if you're missing things like buff strength, attack speed, or basic attack damage rolls, you might find your damage to be a little lacking. However, you'll find your defenses to be excellent, at least once Tiger forms up. So just stick with it for a little bit, and especially as you get to around level 30, your build should come online as you're reaching the endgame. From my experience, it still performed pretty well in the story. I didn't feel squishy, and I was able to take down bosses with relative ease. As one tip to help with that early damage, try to get Utala glyphs with increased basic attack damage, or alternatively, Pakala glyphs with increased attack speed. For a quick TLDR of how stats work, increased basic attack damage scales the base damage of your basic attack. Skill damage scales the base damage of your skills. Flat elemental damage adds to both attacks and skills, making it a great way to get more damage on a build like this, but isn't scaled by those basic stats. If you're curious about how any of the stats work, you can always hit C and pull up your character sheet. That said, I hope you enjoy unleashing your inner fury. Fury. I'm not really sure why it's written that way in the script, I just read things. If you want to see a somewhat crazier build I've been cooking up, do be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, and if you're completely new to Ghostlore, maybe looking for a few tips or tricks, check out my beginner's guide to Ghostlore after this video. On the other hand, if you're not new, I'm curious, what's the craziest or most fun build you've played so far? Be sure to leave some of those down in the comments below. And of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link will be down in the description. If you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out my review of Ghostlore if you haven't already, just to see my thoughts on the game as a whole. If you're new, do check out my beginner's guide, it has a lot of very handy tips and tricks. And if that second build has already released, I'll try to link it up in the card and down in the description. Or you can always go with whatever's on screen right now. Personally, I think one of the greatest strengths about Ghostlore is the build diversity and putting your own character together with 1.5 million trigger skills than just blasting everything. So after you play this build and hopefully find some success with it, try making your own and see how it goes. With that said, thanks for watching, I hope to see you again soon, and do let me know what sort of cool builds you end up finding.